Gaul, 251 AD. A farmer named Lucius stands in the forum, watching his children being led away in chains. He's not a criminal. He's not a traitor. He's simply a man who couldn't pay his taxes. In 3 days, his family will be sold to a wealthy landowner. They'll work fields they once called home, but now as slaves. This isn't fiction. This happened to millions across the Roman Empire. And today, we're going to show you exactly how the greatest civilization in human history turned its own citizens into property. At its height, the Roman Empire controlled over 2 million square miles, from the misty highlands of Britannia to the scorching deserts of Egypt, from the Iberian Peninsula to the fertile crescents of Syria. 50 million people, hundreds of cultures, dozens of languages, all bound together by Roman law, Roman roads, and Roman currency. The denarius, nearly pure silver. For centuries, this coin was the dollar of the ancient world, trusted, stable, universal. A single denarius could buy a day's labor, a loaf of bread, a jug of wine. It flowed through the veins of the empire, lubricating trade, paying soldiers, financing conquest. But coins don't mint themselves. Legions don't feed themselves. Aqueducts don't build. The Roman tax system was a masterpiece of bureaucratic extraction. Land taxes, tributum soli, levied on every acre of farmland. Poll taxes, tributum capitis, collected from every adult head, citizen or not. Customs duties on goods crossing provincial borders. Inheritance taxes, sales taxes, special levies for military campaigns. In Egypt, Rome took 1/3 of the annual grain harvest, every year. No exceptions. In Gaul, land taxes consumed between 40 and 60% of a farm's production. In Syria, tax rates could spike even higher during wartime. But here's what made the system truly brutal. Rome outsourced collection to private contractors called Publicani. Imagine this. The government estimates your province owes 1 million denarii in taxes. A publicanus bids for the contract, agreeing to deliver that million to Rome. But here's the catch. He keeps everything he collects above that amount. It's his profit margin, his incentive, his license to squeeze. Publicani became the most hated men in the empire. They overassessed properties. They demanded bribes. They seized assets without trial. The New Testament mentions them as tax collectors and sinners, grouped with prostitutes and criminals. That wasn't rhetoric. That was public opinion. Meet Marcus Aurelius Severus, not the emperor, but a wheat farmer in North Africa, documented in tax records from 235 AD. Marcus inherited 40 acres from his father. Good land. His family had worked it for 3 generations. In a normal year, his farm produced 800 bushels of wheat. After taxes, he'd keep maybe 350. Tight, but survivable. Then came drought. His harvest dropped to 500 bushels, but his tax burden didn't drop. It increased. The empire needed money for wars on the frontier. Marcus borrowed against next year's harvest. The interest rate? 40% annually. The next year, locusts, another bad harvest. Now Marcus owed more than his farm was worth. He had 3 options: flee and become an outlaw, sell his land for pennies and move to the city slums, or option 3, indenture himself and his family to a wealthy landowner as coloni, bonded laborers tied to the land. Marcus chose option 3. By 240 AD, he and his family worked the same land they'd once owned, but now as bound laborers, legally prohibited from leaving. Free in name, slaves in practice. This wasn't rare. This was routine. By the mid-2nd century, Rome faced a problem. The empire's expenses were growing faster than its revenue. Defending borders from Germanic tribes, Parthians, and Dacians required 30 legions, 180,000 professional soldiers, each expecting regular pay, bonuses, and pension. A legionary earned 225 denarii per year, plus food, equipment, and retirement benefits. Multiply that by 180,000. Add officers, auxiliaries, and support staff. The military consumed nearly 70% of the imperial budget. Then there were public works. The Colosseum alone cost an estimated 100 million sesterces, roughly 25 million denarii. Aqueducts, roads, forums, temples, each a marvel of engineering, each a fiscal black hole. And let's not forget bread and circuses. Rome's population expected free grain distributions and spectacular entertainments. Keeping the mob happy wasn't optional. It was survival for emperors. The cost? Millions of denarii annually. Faced with expenses they couldn't cut and revenues they couldn't raise, emperors made a fateful choice. They debased the currency. Under Augustus, the denarius was 95% silver. By Nero's reign, it had dropped to 90%. By the time of Septimius Severus in 200 AD, it was down to 50%. By the crisis of the 3rd century, some coins contained as little as 2% silver, basically bronze with a silver wash. The result was predictable: inflation. When coins contain less precious metal but are officially worth the same, prices rise to compensate. In 200 AD, a modius of wheat, about 8 liters, cost half a denarius. By 270 AD, it cost 4 denarii. By 301 AD, it cost over 20. Wages couldn't keep pace. A laborer earning 3 denarii per day in 200 AD still earned 3 denarii per day in 270 AD, but now that bought 1/8 as much food. Savings evaporated. Pensions became worthless. The middle class collapsed into poverty. And here's where the spiral accelerated. As inflation destroyed purchasing power, tax revenues in real terms fell, even as nominal tax rates stayed the same. So emperors raised taxes, which pushed more citizens into debt, which reduced economic activity, which lowered tax revenues, which prompted more currency debasement, which caused more inflation. By the mid-3rd century, entire provinces teetered on the edge. In Gaul, the documented case of Julia Faustina tells the story. A widow with 3 children, Julia inherited her husband's bakery in Lugdunum, modern-day Lyon. For 5 years, she ran the business, paying her taxes, feeding her family. In 262 AD, the provincial governor imposed an emergency tax, 20% of all business assets, immediately. Julia didn't have it. She borrowed from a grain merchant at 60% annual interest. The following year, another emergency tax. She borrowed again. By 265 AD, Julia owed more than the bakery was worth. She had no collateral left, no way to borrow more, no way to pay. The creditors seized everything: the bakery, her home, her possessions. But the debt remained. Roman law was clear: debt could be satisfied through labor. Julia and her children were sold at public auction to a textile merchant. The price? Enough to cover the debt and the creditors' fees. Julia was 41 years old. Her children were 8, 10, and 12. They would spend the rest of their lives working in that workshop. Legally, they weren't slaves. They were debt bondsmen. But the distinction was meaningless. They couldn't leave. They couldn't own property. Their children would inherit the debt. In every way that mattered, Julia and her children had been enslaved by the Roman tax system. Empires can endure many things: corruption, military defeat, even bad emperors, but they cannot endure the complete impoverishment of their people. By the 260s, Rome was fracturing. In 260 AD, Gaul erupted, not a barbarian invasion, a tax revolt. Farmers, tradesmen, and minor aristocrats formed what historians call the Gallic Empire. For 14 years, Gaul, Britannia, and Hispania functioned as an independent state. Why? The stated reason in surviving documents: intolerable taxation and currency debasement.
In the east, the city of Palmyra broke away under Queen Zenobia. Syria, Egypt, and much of Asia Minor followed. Again, the grievances centered on fiscal oppression. One contemporary writer recorded, "The people preferred the uncertain rule of a foreign queen to the certain ruin of Roman taxation." At its nadir in 271 AD, Rome controlled less than half the territory it had held 50 years earlier. Not because of military weakness, because of economic collapse. The tax base had imploded. Provinces that once generated revenue now required subsidies just to prevent total dissolution. Enter Diocletian, a soldier from humble origins who seized power in 284 AD. He looked at the smoldering wreckage of the Roman economy and made a decision: total reform. No more currency debasement, no more inflation, no more chaos. In 301 AD, Diocletian issued the Edict of Maximum Prices, a comprehensive price control law covering over 1,300 goods and services. Bread, wine, meat, clothing, labor, transport, all received fixed maximum prices enforceable by death penalty. It was an economic catastrophe. When you cap prices below the rate of inflation, supply disappears. Farmers stopped bringing grain to market. Craftsmen hoarded raw materials. Within months, shortages rippled across the empire. The black market thrived, the legal economy withered. Diocletian's own edict acknowledged the problem. Greed runs riot, and goods vanish from markets. His solution? More severe penalties. It failed. By 305 AD, the price controls were quietly abandoned, but the damage was done. Trust in Roman economic management had evaporated. Meanwhile, the countryside was dying. Freed from debt bondage, but broken by poverty, millions of former farmers abandoned the land. They fled to cities, creating massive urban poverty, or they became brigands, preying on the remnants of trade, or they simply died. Malnutrition, disease, despair. By the early 4th century, agricultural production had collapsed by an estimated 40%. The empire that once fed 50 million struggled to feed 30 million. Food imports from Egypt and North Africa kept Rome and Constantinople alive, but provincial cities starved. You might think this is ancient history, a cautionary tale from a dead empire with no relevance to our modern world. You'd be wrong. The playbook Rome used has been repeated with minor variations across centuries and continents. When governments spend beyond their means, they face the same choice Rome faced: cut spending, raise taxes, or debase currency. And time and again, they choose debasement. Weimar Germany, 1923. Hyperinflation reaches 4 trillion marks to $1. Life savings become worthless overnight. The middle class is obliterated. The social trauma paves the way for extremism. Zimbabwe, 2008. Inflation peaks at 79.6 billion% month over month. The currency collapses so completely that the country abandons it entirely and adopts foreign currencies. Venezuela, 2018. Inflation exceeds 1 million% annually. Doctors and engineers flee the country, leaving behind a failed state. Oil-rich Venezuela reduced to economic catastrophe by fiscal mismanagement and currency destruction. Today, global government debt exceeds $91 trillion, over 100% of global GDP. The United States national debt stands at $36 trillion and rising. Japan's debt is 260% of GDP. Greece, Italy, Portugal, all carrying debt loads that would have terrified Roman emperors. And when debt becomes unsustainable, the printing press is run. Quantitative easing, monetary expansion, modern terms for an ancient practice, currency debasement. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet has expanded from $800 billion in 2008 to over $8 trillion in 2020. The European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, the People's Bank of China, all following the same script. The result? Inflation. Housing prices that have tripled in a generation. College tuition that outpaces wage growth by 8 times. Healthcare costs that bankrupt families. The middle class, like Rome's farmers, squeezed between stagnant wages and rising costs.
Personal debt in developed nations has exploded. In the United States, household debt exceeds $17 trillion. Student loans alone top $1.7 trillion. Credit card debt, auto loans, mortgages, all at record highs. The mechanisms differ from Roman debt bondage, but the effect rhymes. Individuals trapped by obligations they cannot escape, working to service debt rather than build wealth. Rome didn't fall in a day. It bled out over generations, a slow decay masked by the grandeur of monuments and the rhetoric of eternal empire. The legions held the borders for centuries after the economy had hollowed out. The Senate met in marble halls even as provinces slipped away. The appearance of strength persisted long after the substance had eroded. But empires are not built on appearances. They're built on the prosperity and consent of their people. When taxation becomes confiscation, when currency becomes worthless, when debt becomes bondage, consent fractures, and without consent, only force remains. Rome tried force. It wasn't enough. In the ruins of Pompeii, archaeologists found graffiti. "I don't want to be a soldier. I don't want to pay taxes. I want to live." Written by someone whose name we'll never know, who lived and died under the weight of an empire that demanded everything and gave back less and less. That voice, anonymous, desperate, human, echoes across 2 millennia, because the fundamental truth hasn't changed. No system, however powerful, can long survive if it impoverishes the people it claims to serve. We look at our own civilization and see permanence. Skyscrapers, technology, global markets. Surely we're beyond the mistakes of ancient Rome. But Rome thought the same. Every empire does, right up until the moment it isn't true anymore. The mechanisms have changed. We have central banks instead of imperial mints, digital currency instead of silver coins, complex financial instruments instead of simple debt contracts. But the underlying dynamics remain. Spend beyond your means, debase your currency, tax your people into desperation. The sequence is the same. The outcome is predictable. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And right now, our civilization is rhyming with Rome in uncomfortable ways. Not because we're doomed to repeat every mistake. We're not. We have knowledge, technology, and democratic institutions Rome never possessed. But we also have the same human tendencies. Short-term thinking, political expedience, the temptation to defer hard choices to future generations. The question isn't whether we can avoid Rome's fate. We can. The question is whether we will. Whether we'll make the hard choices, fiscal discipline, monetary stability, sustainable taxation, before crisis forces them upon us. Whether we'll remember that empires are not eternal, that prosperity is not guaranteed, and that the freedom of citizens is easily lost and rarely regained. Rome gave us roads, laws, engineering, literature, and the foundations of Western civilization. But perhaps its greatest gift is this, a warning. Written in the currency they debased, carved into the tax records they kept, whispered in the chains they forged for their own people. They built an empire that lasted 1,000 years, and they destroyed it themselves. Not with swords, but with coins. Not through conquest, but through taxation. Not because they were invaded, but because they made the choice, again and again, to sacrifice their citizens' freedom and prosperity for the illusion of imperial grandeur. The Roman Empire fell. The question for us is, will we learn from their fall, or follow them into it?